things that everybody is required to obey at any time: the qawl of Allah and the qawl of Rasulullah. So the idea that the authority of the messenger goes with the authority of God, and this ties in with what Brother Israr was saying in one of the earlier sessions, that there is this co-equal authority and that everything else is subordinate to these two qawl, the qawl of Allah and the qawl of the Rasul, and that nothing else is binding. So he raises the idea of the sunnah beyond the sunnah of the community to the sunnah of the Rasul. And then the hadith, the akhbar, become the repository of that sunnah. Because then, after he convinces his opponent that yes, we must obey the Rasul, we agree on that, yes, we need to, that the wisdom is something other than the kitab. The kitab and the hikmah are two different things. He gets to the point of, how do we obey the Rasul? Because, of course, Shafi is 204 years after Hijrah's his death, and he's believed to have written the Jima' al-Ilm in the last years of his life while he was in Egypt. So we're 200 years later, we don't see him, but we're required to obey him. How do we do that? We have to do it on the basis of reports that we hear about him. So he brings these ideas together and he builds this foundation. And he convinces eventually by the end of section 1 his opponent of all akhbar that yes, akhbar are something that we must follow. Then he moves into his discussion with the opponent of khabar al-khasa. And al-khasa here probably means the elite individuals, the people amongst the Prophet's companions who had specialized knowledge that was not available to everyone. It's not necessarily, I think, synonymous with khabar ahad, but there is some suggestion in the Risala that he may be using these in a similar fashion. Again, the terminology that's later developed in fiqh seems to be somewhat fluid here in this time. And if anybody has any ideas of, for nuancing understandings of Shafi's terminology, I'm open to that, because that is something that I did not look at in depth. But because Shafi's terminology seems more fluid than later fiqh terminology. And then he moves to the idea of what about these particular hadith, these isolated hadith, because the opponents of isolated hadith don't reject the mutawatir hadith, the ones that they're absolutely sure of. They're not rejecting those. So Shafi has built his doctrinal basis for the authority of hadith in arguing with people who reject all of them. But then he has to address those who reject only ones that are, from isolated individuals and not mutawatir. And so this is where Shafi begins to develop the concept of what constitutes ijma' and does not constitute ijma'. Because the rejecter of isolated hadith says, well, this is not something that people agree on, so we want to take the agreement of the majority. And Shafi says, how do you know who the majority is? How do you decide? If there are 10 scholars in an area that agree on something, and one of them's absent when they discuss something, do you still have a majority? What if 5 of them aren't there? Do you still have a majority? How do you decide? And so he comes to the point of, there are very few things on which the Muslim community actually agrees, actually has some kind of ijma'. And the example that he gives is that dhuhr is 4 rakahs. So there are certain things that Shafi sees the Muslim community in agreement on, but he sees a very limited role for that agreement. So that then, just because the broad group of Muslims does not agree on a particular hadith from someone with specialized knowledge, an individual companion, doesn't mean that that story should not have authority. in a particular area. And he uses the example of if you go to the market and you're buying cloth and there's a dispute that's taken to court over the quality of the cloth, who do you call in? Do you call in people just who have broad knowledge, or do you call in specialists? So he argues for the idea that people with specialized knowledge are people whose testimony has authority, and therefore people with specialized knowledge from among the companions of the Prophet also have a similar kind of authority. So he's tying in ways that make sense to his audience, to his interlocutor, to convince this person. So he brings these kind of mundane examples to show that this is what you do in daily life. And he also talks about the transmitters of the hadith, because he talks about, and he, in doing this, he brings the example of going to court. And he says to his opponent, what if this man, what if this man kills someone, and what do you do with him? And his opponent says, well, of course, I bring witnesses, and if he killed him, then, I kill him and I give his, belongings to the heirs of the victim. So he says, this man killed someone and took his money. What do you do with him? Well, I bring witnesses to prove that he killed him, and then we kill him and give the money to the heirs of the victims. And Shafi says, well, how do you call the witnesses? Do you and figure out their trustworthiness? And he says, well, we call them, if they appear to be trustworthy, then only God knows the unseen. So, and then Shafi argues we have a much higher standard for people who transmit hadith. The muhaddith, there's a much higher standard than the witness in court. How can you take somebody's life? And this is where Shafi comes back to the idea of doubt, because one of the points about doubt that the opponents of hadith made is you doubt the veracity sometimes of the individuals. Somebody made a mistake in a hadith. Somebody could make a mistake, somebody might not remember. And so Shafi says, but you'll take someone's life on the basis of someone that you're not absolutely sure of, because he could forget, he could make a mistake, the eyewitness could be wrong, and you're willing to take somebody's life. We have a much higher standard for people from whom we get stories from the Prophet. So this higher standard, and again, he's trying to show his opponents that they don't follow their own rationale. Their own rationale that they're attempting to use about doubt of people in the chains of transmitters, about the Quran explaining everything, which is where the religious practice discussion comes in later. So all the way along, Shafi is using the Quran and the reasoning used by the opponents in order to build his case against their point of view. And when he gets to the discussion of religious practices, he brings this full circle, because the question then becomes, how would we practice the religion without the akhbar? And he gets his opponent to admit, and this is one of the things that we see today, if we look at the discussions of people who oppose hadith today, we see exactly the same thing happening. The idea that Shafi says, okay, the Quran says establish salat, but it doesn't say how many times a day, how many rak'ahs, how do you do it, how do you know how you do it? And the opponent of the akhbar agrees. It could be once a day, it could be once every few days, so that essentially anyone can do whatever he wants and call it salat, pay whatever he wants and call it zakat, and then everyone is doing, because they're